This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Jasmyn, Jazz, Story as our guest today, and wow, do they have a story for us. Jazz has been a restorative practitioner for over a decade where they have focused on helping women, children, trans, and non-binary folk. Jazz talks about types of harm, American culture, and their experiences in this podcast. Just a heads up, Jazz does briefly share their impactful story about experiencing sexual violence around the 16-minute mark. So if that's not something you're looking to hear today, you can either skip over it to the 22-minute mark or just catch our next episode. You can also check out our YouTube channel where we have been posting podcast highlights, and you can check out our Future Ancestors Collective where we are holding community spaces to fit your needs. Well, without further ado, let's get into this conversation.
Welcome, Jasmyn. Who are you?
I am Jasmyn Lee Story. I go by Jazz to most who know me. I am a restorative justice facilitator and educator. I am also a doula, and I am a PhD student at the wonderful Tuskegee University. Go Tigers. So that is me.
Who are you?
Who am I, though? Who am I? I am the same little person that watched the Feed the Children commercials of the 90s with anger and disgust and confusion at the lack of action and the kind of trained apathy of the adults around me who also consumed those commercials as they came on the television, and the fire that put in my little body, seeing little bodies that look like me, hungry and starving and being structurally harmed, has always been a part of what I do. Who am I? I am that 5-year-old staring at public television, wondering why the world isn't stopping at this news.
Yeah. Who are you? I don't know if you remember on the podcast, I asked it 7 times.
You think you're ready.
Yeah. Well, you burned a lot of it in the first one, but you dug yourself into this situation. So, who are you?
I'm a builder. I think.
Yeah.
I'm a builder. I'm a curator.
Yeah.
I think that it is pretty aligned that the consulting group I co-founded is called Honeycomb. I see myself like that. I'm a little worker bee.
Mm-hmm. Who are you?
Ooh, oh man. Oh man. I'm growing. I am a growing person. I am deeply reflective and constantly processing and possibly over-processing. My thoughts probably have been run over like Kraft cheese way too many times. And man, I wasn't ready for the third one. I thought that I thought that builder one would have
we
gotten
we
it.
have 3 more, and so I want to give you the out that like you can use one-word answers for each of these if you so choose. But who are you?
I am someone who is actively healing, and in actively healing, I have found lots of ways that contribute to that work. Some of it is interpersonal, some of it is private. A lot of my healing, though, is public. A lot of my healing is interdependent on others. A lot of my healing is collective. It's work that I do in community. A lot of my healing is through education, learning from my students as they learn from me. I am a healing person. I am constantly in this active motion of uncovering and laying to rest what I've grieved to plant something new. Uncovering, laying to rest what I've grieved, and planting something new. And this constant cycle, be it working through my own interpersonal lifespan harm or intergenerational harm or structural harm that I live within a particular context. Whatever it is, it's this constant process. I am always in motion. It's not a stagnant identity. It is a ever-changing identity that I think doing this work and being witnessed by others is interesting because my community constantly reminds me of how much motion there is as we all are shifting how we see ourselves, how we show up for each other, this constant identity of being a healing person, a person in the process of healing in all forms, the hard work and the joyful work of celebrating the big W wins and the little W wins.
Who are you?
Oh no! I love it. I love it so much. Woo! Golly. This must be how my middle schoolers felt. You forget when it feels like to be asked questions when you are a question asker. And how beautifully probing this is. I'm loving this. Who am I? I am expansive. And that is not something that an earlier iteration of me would have been able to acknowledge and recognize. But I see that I'm expansive. I'm expansive in my work. I'm expansive as I experience stillness. I am always imagining new ways of doing things, exploring old ways of doing things and remixing them in my head like a really, really good club mix. I am constantly pulling from what is around me, being inspired by what's around me, and creating these gumbos of processes, of experiences that are all inspired by everything around me. So I guess in very much ways I'm also a sponge. I'm very sponge-like. If I read it and I consume it and it sits with me, it doesn't matter where it comes from. I might be reading about China's aid development in sub-Saharan Africa and find something there that speaks to me about how I want to run a circle series in Alabama. I can pull from anything around me and find worth in that information, find value in that information, and have it further what I'm doing. I mean, everything from what I wear to how I show up for my community is very sponge-like.
Yeah. And finally, who are you?
I am cataclysmic. Catalyst. I'm a catalyst. I'm catalytic. Catalytic. I like to be the person who can look into a fridge and see a meal. I like to approach my communities in that way, where I can see the strengths and assets that community holds, and just ask the right questions to support and empower those who hold those strengths, hold those assets, to walk into a collaborative space with another person who has an asset that might contribute to our larger collective goal, whatever that be. So I'm like an enzyme. I'm a catalyst. I like to help make things happen. And like an enzyme in your stomach in sometimes very toxic environments.
Well, thank you, Jasmyn, so much for going deep.
I guess my last thing, I should have said I am a nerd. I think that's big nerd. I can't believe I just said that about enzymes.
I mean, you were all those things and more. Like, this is by far the most in-depth that somebody has gone with all these, so I was fully embracing and enjoying that. Really, thank you so much for going that in-depth in the first 10 minutes. We're going to talk about the intersections of all of those things over the next little bit together, but it's always good to check in. So to the fullest extent of the question, or however you want to answer, how are you?
How am I? I am in flux. So right now I am kind of juggling a bunch of little startups all at once. I recently purchased a 15-acre farm called Freedom Farm Azul, and am working hard to make that space a space that can serve the South as a healing center, as an educational space, as a retelling of our story space. And that is something that takes energy. Building takes a lot of energy. So that plus my consulting work and finishing my PhD, I am good, but I am in flux. My energy is sometimes high, my energy is sometimes low. I deal with chronic illnesses and chronic pain, so that is also an experience that happens in flux. It's never one experience, it's never stagnant, very much in flux. So right now I'm in a really great place relative to where I've been. So how am I right now? I am in flux, but I am eager.
Yeah. I'm curious, with all that's going on, both in your life and in the world, how you're finding the space to even out that flux or balance and take care of yourself.
I have recently, for my own sake, rejected the concept of balance. Okay. And that was really important for me. Rejecting the concept of balance. I felt like I was constantly striving for balance. And though I didn't actually know what balance would be for me, I couldn't really define it. I think I was always trying to tack on other people's idea of self-care and like a holistic day, and try to force myself to do that. It's like, oh yeah, 6 a.m. yoga today, we got it. And like, no we don't. No we do not. We don't have it. We think we have it, but we don't. And so I think for me, grace has been the best thing. It's just giving myself grace, setting intentions, and then giving myself grace when those intentions are not met. But not allowing myself to lose track of those intentions. So I'm not in a place right now where I feel like I am absolutely achieving the holistic care that I need to provide myself every single day. That's not where I am. But my little win that I'm very excited about is that there's no shame in this anymore. So this is a space where these intentions that do not get met with action, there's grace there, there's reflection on why that happened, and then we move on, which seems very small, but that's a really big thing to be able to be like, okay, I meant to get up and meditate today. Did not make it to meditate today. I acknowledge that this is something that's important for me. I acknowledge that this is something that will be crucial for my own personal sustaining. And I can also acknowledge that these are the things that created barriers for me to get to my mat today. This is maybe what I could do tomorrow, and have grace in that and walk away from that moment, which I think in past would be a place where I might actually carry shame through that reflection and then carry shame throughout the day, which is counterproductive to this idea of trying to get to this place where I am taking care of myself holistically.
Yeah, no, that's a helpful reframe, and like that works differently for everybody. I'm curious, like, you've talked about so much of your work being around healing, and you've had this desire to fight for justice from the time that you were a little kid. This podcast is around the idea of restorative justice, but obviously you've been doing the work a lot longer than you knew the words. How did this get started for you?
I think that you're absolutely right. I've been showing up for community for as long as I could remember. Even in high school, I don't know if this is actually flattering, but there was, my sister is a junior Olympian. And we, at the time of high school, we were like physical doppelgangers. Like, she was athletic and fit, and like I was not. Oh, that's not what I look like. But like, nobody who was around us in the same physical space could not tell that we were so much sisters. And there was this one time where my English teacher overheard my sister and I responding to a girl who was crying in the hallway, and we just were no nonsense about this. We were like, we will handle this. Who did this? Who harmed you? Like, what did they say? And where are they right now? And so afterwards, my English teacher, he told me that he had overheard this interaction. He goes, so I'm going to start calling you and your sisters the Donnas. And I was like, what? And he's like the female version of Dawn in the manga. Because that's who you guys are on campus. You're the Donnas. And I was like, that's really funny that he's like, he could recognize that we saw injustices happening, that the educators were either not fit to handle or were not making it to their table, and felt like we needed to find our own way to get that done. Now, I have to say, anybody who knew us in high school knew that was punitive and full of shame. Our tactics were not above board, which is probably why we really also earned the title the Donnas. But how did I get to a point where my understanding of justice wasn't rooted in punitive responses to others? Really came out of my own survivor story. I was living two parallel experiences with the criminal justice system at the same time. When I turned 18, I, on the one hand, had a brother who was formerly incarcerated, who was like a dad to me when I was younger, and that was something that caused deep divides and anger and harm in my world, to be disconnected to someone so important and crucial to who I was as a person, someone I loved so much. And then I was the victim of sexual violence going through a criminal justice process within the city of Atlanta. And so I'm dealing with the system in these two different spaces. And from both spaces, I'm just dumbfounded at how none of this seems to do anything positive. In no way could anyone, even at that time, before I understood mass incarceration, before I had the language and the stats to back up my thoughts and opinions, I knew that the 10 years assigned to my brother in no way contributed positively to society or rectified anything that the state identified he may have done. And then on the other side, I'm going through this process as a victim of a violent crime, and I'm looking at how none of my needs are being met, how I'm constantly being re-traumatized, almost to like a hilarious degree, like the first videotape, because I swear it was a VHS, they forgot to push record, so I had to come back like the next day and like do it all over again, like it was a sitcom. Like for some reason, like I walked into Brooklyn Nine-Nine and not like the actual city police of Atlanta. And I'm just looking, I'm like, this does not work. This doesn't work. And the anger that caused, the anger I was harboring, which was so unhealthy to me, was identified by my advisor in college, who was a social work professor who actually used to specialize in victims of the crimes that I had recently survived. And he is the one who suggested that I take mediation after my first semester of college with David Karp and Duke Fisher. And I was 19, still very angry, still suffering from PTSD in many different ways. And I think the most relevant to this conversation was isolation. Self-isolation was one of the ways that my PTSD manifested. And here I am in this training, and everything is interactive. We're being asked to share with each other. And I'm just like, I'm also Southern, so I don't believe in like sharing my business out in public. Like, this is my laundry for me alone to know. But here we are being encouraged to do so, where Duke Fisher is making it very clear that this vulnerability is going to be crucial for us to move forward with the people we're working with. And therefore, as we are being guinea pigs for each other, it's important that we give that authentic experience of sharing, of sitting with how scary it is to share moments of harm and experiences of harm. But I left there, and our closing circle, I'll never forget it. They asked us, like, what are you taking away with you? And I looked up and I was like, listening is a form of love. And as cliche and funny as it is to say now, for me at 19 years old, coming from a place of Southern culture where formality and conversation is its own art. It does not necessarily mean there's vulnerability there. Mm-hmm. Knowing how to conversate is, not converse, conversate, is an art form. So it's not something where you're going to be vulnerable, or you're going to necessarily deeply say how you're feeling, or you're probably not even going to deeply show empathy with what you've heard. Bless your little heart is not empathy. So at 19, I'm quickly realizing that there's like this new thing out here that people are doing out here in the streets called listening, and it feels really good. like this is cool. And so that's how I got started. David Karp picked me out of that training and offered me a job. I was a work-study student, so that was crucial to my existence, and I couldn't think of a better way to spend my time working on campus than to be learning more just in proximity of him. Copying books for his trainings and classes and looking at this literature, reading about mass incarceration, all from the student admin desk, and really just absorbing all I could, while at the same time using that same computer to correspond with my brother who's incarcerated, and using my Skidmore, work computer to talk to pretend to be my brother's lawyer so I could get the wardens of these prisons to tell me why he was in solitary every time he ended up in solitary. So I'm living this experience full time, dealing with these oppressive systems while making copies of information that's allowing me to understand that there is a tool out there that could shift how I experienced being a victim of crime, and also how my brother experienced being someone who's accused of crime.
Yeah.
And I've just been doing it ever since, just different ways, just never let it go. Yeah. I went to school thinking that I was going to be an actress and an anthropologist. And so this was a hard detour from what I landed on campus to do.
Yeah, I'm curious, when that, shift, I guess, goodbye Hollywood, goodbye Broadway, what was that shift?
Oh, it was immediately. It was mediation immediately. I think that the way I used to, I am not pitting these two individuals together, but they do represent different aspects of advocacy culture. I think all my life I wanted to be an Angelina Jolie and a Princess Di. After Trayvon Martin was killed, I wanted to be an Amal Clooney. And so my understanding of what my role was, it's like I don't want to necessarily be an advocate to help define the problem, which is crucial to movement building. I want to be in a space where I'm actually pushing policy, I'm pushing laws, I'm holding elected officials accountable for the change that I want to see, or forcing them to actualize the change that they've signed on to implement in whatever space they were in. And so the murder of Trayvon Martin, it never left my body. It's even still hard for me to even reflect on the feeling of that moment. I am not far from Trayvon's age. And so when this happened, I think my own aspirations felt too rooted in ego. And I think that I started to shift my understanding of servitude. And that's where I wanted to be. I wanted to figure out how I could serve the individuals who were trying to end the existence of the interpersonal structure and historical violence that is deeply connected to racism. And then at the same time, the individuals who were creating and dreaming up alternatives to replace the systems that, though the first group were identifying as harmful and problematic and antiquated.
Yeah. So you talked about how David Karp was someone who helped expose you to so many of those ideas. Who were the other people that you were learning from?
So I had the opportunity to study in South Africa while I was at Skidmore, and I was a part of the SIT Field School. It was a human rights focus field school program in Cape Town. And one of the blessings of this experience, and I think it's really important in like the age of lack of accountability, or the sustained age of lack of accountability, that I expose my own ignorance. So despite the fact that when I was a baby, I was blessed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, I did not have any understanding of apartheid before landing in South Africa. Did not do my pre-reading before landing in South Africa. So I definitely did not know what historically I was walking into, why these individuals that are lauded are, like, what they were lauded for, right? Like, I tell people, I was like, oh yeah, I was blessed by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. I have no idea why that's important. Like, no idea. No, yeah, everyone's like, oh, I want to go to Robben Island. I was like, no idea. I was like, where is it, a beach? Right? Like, I had no, tragically ignorant.
Yeah.
But it was a blessing, because by being tragically ignorant, I didn't have to learn this history from anybody but South Africans.
Yeah.
And that was a beautiful blessing. And one of the opportunities that our wonderful leader, Stuart, provided for us was to work with team members, a team member from the TRC, one of the investigators, and go through one of the cases he investigated from start to finish and his process.
Yeah, really quick, I want to make sure that folks know the context. So Robben Island was the place where Nelson Mandela and so many others were held off the coast of Cape Town, right? The TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, post-apartheid, that allowed the country to come back together. I think those were all the things. Desmond Tutu was really formative in helping make sure that process happened, along with Nelson Mandela and so many others. Sorry, go for it. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. So there are many members of this commission. Desmond Tutu became very much the face of this commission, but there were teams of investigators who had to figure out how to support this story being told with dignity for all of the both living victims and the survivors of those who had their lives lost, stolen, broken, and this work, learning from this man about this work, shifted my understanding of restorative justice, because I was then learning about communal justice, storytelling from a South African context and a sub-Saharan African context that really started to resonate with me in a different way. I had a different understanding because I started to see that the things that make this possible happen prior to harm. That community being built, sustained, being healthy, having a communal understanding of this is how we take care of each other. Like, this is how we show up. This is it. It is so important for when we get to a point where it's like, we gotta hold so-and-so accountable. Well, it's like, okay, well, there's already this collective understanding that that's our responsibility, that we take care of us.
Right.
And that was something that I needed to see. I needed to understand that, and I needed to see it for my own budding identity as a practitioner and a facilitator for how I was going to go about teaching and training this work. Because when you bring this to an American context, so much of the harm of our communities post the 70s is communal breakdown. Mm-hmm. It is serious interfamily breakdown. It is larger neighborhood breakdown. It is social capital destruction. So when it comes to bringing in this work to respond to harm, I started to really make sure that I asked this first question about, like, do we actually believe that, like, we got us?
Right. The idea in South Africa, like, of Ubuntu, right? Like, a person is a person through another person, but if you don't acknowledge the humanity of the other people who happen to be in your community, why should you take the time to try to repair that, right? If that's not the assumption that we're working from, we're not going to get very far down this path of reconciliation and repair.
Right. It's the question, like, who are you? Like, I had a middle schooler when I worked in Brooklyn look at me, and I was like, okay, but, this is your friend. And they looked at me, they put their hand up and go, that is my acquaintance. And I'll never forget it, because I was like, well, you have now made me understand why. Like, what is one of the barriers between making this reparative moment happen is that neither of you feel obligated to each other. Mm-hmm. And you don't feel like anything being fostered in this space has communicated to you that you are obligated to each other. So I can't be upset at you because you just told me that person's an acquaintance. All right? I'm the RJ person on campus. That means I need to go back to step 1, 2, and 3 to make sure that there is a communal ethos here, because there isn't.
That's something that I struggle with so much as we've tried to frame, this is something that I've struggled so much with as we've tried to frame restorative justice work through Amplify RJ, right? Because people know the word restorative justice are about repairing harm, but that is not 80% of the work, right? Like, we'll get there, but, like, how do you see each other, right? How do you see yourself as a part of this community? And how are we supporting each other in all of that? And I think, like, I might be guilty of, like, overemphasizing the community piece where people aren't getting to the place where, like, we are repairing harm, and the repair of harm is important. And that's where I'm like, I have a difficulty finding, I'm going to use the word balance because I think it's appropriate here.
It is.
But yeah, that is so crucial and gets forgotten or left out so much of the time.
I think it's hard because it's antithetical to our culture. Like, we are all deeply rooted in American culture. In America, this is for all, and I am using this word because I want all of the historical harm to be felt behind it. This is the land of cowboys. Mm-hmm. So this is the land of the individual who believes that they alone are mandated to take care of themselves alone and use whatever resources available, either bought or stolen or violently taken, to achieve their own desired goals or outcomes. And that individual focus will always be, until shifted, a block in how we do the community piece, because it's something that we all have learned. It is a part of our space, and it's a part of how we understand each other. So the undoing of that I and that transformation into a we for a community is way harder than I think most communities actually can even grasp, because they're so used to a negative piece, right? They're just like, they're used to this, well, if nothing's on fire, everybody's happy, versus this true feeling of interdependentness, interconnection, having this desire to be independent be nourished by the communal reality around you, right? And wanting to give that to another person. That is just, it's so far from how so many of us are formed, even those of us who did grow up in communal spaces within the United States. At the end of the day, we are all dripping in American culture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think back to a conversation that I had with Tema Okun, the person who wrote the article around characteristics of white supremacy culture. And, you know, if the United States is built on white supremacy culture is to disconnect folks, right? To keep folks separate from each other, to pit folks against each other, right? To achieve like some goal of like more power, when we can share that power and work together for that instead of going after it individualistically. And that is ingrained in every single institution in our society.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do, but starting with acknowledging, even in the most micro of our experience, where there could be communal building, is important. I had my little brother who's a grown man, last year, he like sent a text message. He goes, "This family does not communicate well. We need a family meeting to have a discussion. Everyone must be present." And it reminded me that, like, even as an RJ person, I might not be seeing even what is right in front of my face as an opportunity to increase what a communal existence actually looks like. What does interdependence look like from my most basic human unit, which is my family?
Yeah.
And so I think about, with our organizations, if we as individuals can be so blind to this, then we are going to struggle to move our organizations without bringing that same level of removal to it, right? Like, often you'll meet with principals and they'll be like, the staff loves the staff. They love each other and they love me. And then you meet with the staff and they're just like,
this mofo.
We drink.
Yeah, right.
Like, that's like, they're like, no, it's Jack Daniels. That's what it is. After 5, like, that it's so easy to see calm water and assume that all the fishies are living in a good community under the ocean. And that's just not the case all the time. It takes a hard look and to really ask, with grace, what is our intention? What are those barriers? And how can we just set a new intention informed by those barriers and have grace in that, and not feel like we should be ashamed because we're not all hunky-dory.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that has me thinking about is institutional change is very, very difficult. It's time-consuming. It's that reflection piece for all the individuals in an organization and like the people who are invested in the organization as currently constructed have a lot of work to do. That doesn't prevent any individual person from doing this work, right? And that's hard. And there are lots of ways that, I think there are limits to what individuals can do, But sometimes this work doesn't happen without those individuals deciding to take that on for themselves, to be the catalyst, as it were, or the disruptor, and a model, right? Not that they're getting it perfectly, but that they are inviting people into another way.
Absolutely. I think one of my favorite implementation stories from the globe is Hull, England. Hull, the United Kingdom. There's this city called Hull, Hull. They are the UK's first restorative city. I put it in parentheses because I feel like, just like the New York's best pizza, I don't know who the governing board is for these titles, but as far as Hull is concerned, they are the UK's first restorative city, and their story started with one person. It started with one educator who saw what was going on in Vermont, decided to shift her classroom, and it became contagious. What was going on in her classroom, then the other individuals wanted to know. It worked its way up, then their school, and then the district, and then the government, all the way to the football team. So, like, I agree with you. I think that, to the point of addressing self and addressing home as a crucial step to doing any of this work, who knows who you will then inspire as you are allowing yourself to be seen in vlogs. Trying it out, trying to make change, sharing your intention, and asking for grace when you feel like you didn't need it.
Yeah, for sure. I'm curious. There are two questions in my mind. One is like, who are the people that have inspired you in that kind of way? I think the flip side of that is to ask you to brag on yourself and say, who are the people that you have inspired, or what are the places that you've inspired this change? Because I know that both answers come with a lot of stories. And I know the first question is a lot easier for you to answer.
The first one is a lot easier for me to answer because I think it's sometimes overwhelming for me to think about the second one. So, who inspires me? Cheryl Wilson and Fanya Davis and Sujatha and Nuri and Sonia Shaw. I know I just rattled off a bunch of names.
Well, I know who all those people are, but
and you know who I know.
Right?
I feel like I was like, for the audience, I apologize because I did not rattle off everybody's name with the last name, but these ferocious, graceful, passionate femmes I saw for the first time in 2015. I was still trying to decide if this is what I was going to do. I was about to move to London to get my master's in international law and human rights. And then I was in a room with many of them to discuss what would become the PRISM project document on using restorative practices to address sexual violence and gender-based violence.
On college campuses.
Here we were in this thing on college campuses. And we're in this room and we're in this think tank, and I got to observe them move. I got to observe them speak truth to power in ways that I had not seen. My restorative justice work and entry into this space was very northeastern, white, higher ed, with a little bit of like 70s hippie to it. Like, that was the vibe, right? So I'll tell you what, at our trainings, toes were out. That's what I'm saying. We got some Birkenstock vibes, right? So
that is so funny. Like, that's totally accurate, and I've never thought about it in that sense.
That if I could describe different houses of restorative justice by shoes, I probably could do a really good job. So I came into this work of the Birkenstock variety, and I felt like I was missing something in my own practice when I was doing that. I felt like when I was dealing with bias cases, like, we were doing great work because we were handling it. Cases that people weren't going to touch, where these people would be harmed, but I didn't feel like what we did was enough. I never felt that way. I felt very dissatisfied with the bias work that I felt like I was co-facilitating. And again, I hold myself to like probably a ridiculous standard, but I was looking for answers. That frustration was questions. How do I do this better? How do I do this better? And so then I sit there and I watch these individuals who look like me and have no issue speaking to the holes in thought or process, speaking to the gaps that would eventually lead to possible disproportionate treatment of different groups, even within a restorative context. I'm listening to them without fear name what needed to be named. And in that modeling, I realized that restorative justice did not belong to anyone. It did not belong to one practitioner. It did not belong to one group. And it can't, because when it does, what happens is you get an echo chamber of just like the same chorus of voices over and over again, which is the problem with so much of our current punitive systems. And so after observing them, I was able to shift my understanding to what my role was. That like I never should be in a space where I am quiet, which sounds wild, but it needed to be observed to be learned. That I needed to know that even though I only had 3 years of RJ under my belt at that time as a facilitator, that I know and I have every right to push our movement further, to ask those hard questions just because I'm here.
Yeah.
Just because I'm here. Questions don't hurt anybody. Well, they shouldn't. And so there was no reason for me not to ask those questions. There was no reason for me not to stand up for the individuals that are on my head and on my heart and who I work with and who I grew up with and who I call family, who have been harmed by these systems. And it's important to protect the groups that are consistently harmed in not finding the same thing in this new alternative space that we're trying to carve out for this nation.
Yeah. What is one of the ways that you've done that really stands out to you? So I have, while at an alternative middle school, I utilize, in my restorative justice processes, I utilize conferencing for the most part, coming from the family group conferencing model that first comes from New Zealand and the Maori people, the whanau, the family group conferencing process, but a lot of the conferencing scripts actually come from what Australia did with that model. And so I use a hybrid of those. And in that space, there's a question about harm. And in the past, doing this work, and based on my training, I utilized 3 harm categories: emotional, spiritual harm, material, physical harm, and communal relational harm. Right? This is what I learned specifically from David Cart. Mm-hmm. And as I continued to do this work for years, I realized that when it came to instances of power imbalance, that I didn't have a framework that allowed me to set up an experience for the participants to fully understand the power dynamic and the harm of power imbalance in their context. So I was dealing with a student who, a black girl who's like 13, 14, unbelievably brilliant, and bored, and that can be a very interesting combination at an alternative high school. And so what she would do, she could figure out anybody's button and she could know how to like push it, right? That was her superhero talent. And actually in my notes, like in my RJ notes, I remember I wrote her, she was always the letter L in my notes, which stood for Loki, because I just felt like she was that brilliant creator mind. And she at one point got pulled in after went through multiple administrators and teachers because she had
yelled at multiple of her classmates who she knew had national origins that were unbelievably diverse, but kept calling all of them Mexican. And she kept doing it. She then, after the election of 2000, I can't even think, this last 4 years has been a blur. The election, she decided to double down and say, I hope that they send you all back to Mexico. And so when it came to holding her accountable, she had the retort, well, I can't be racist, I'm Black. And every educator you can imagine just shut down and passed her on to the next educator because they had no idea how to respond. And so she got to me, and I'm sitting here trying to figure out, all right, how do I restoratively have this conversation without telling her that what she did was wrong? How do I stay in a space of restorative inquiry? How do I use this framework without inserting myself into the process, without forcing any motivated reflection from her? And so I was playing with language in my head. And so when it came to the 4 harm categories, I just decided to play with the idea of inflammation. I was like, do you see in this moment any place where structural or historical violence has been inflamed? And she cracks up. She doesn't say yes. She cracks up because I sat there and I started laughing because I realized she was delighted that someone got her. That was a question that she was willing to walk into accountability for. We were able to have a whole conversation about how she understands that she was inflaming the moment of the election. She was inflaming the xenophobia being pushed by Trump. She was inflaming the lived fear that she was actually hearing that is historical from her friends and classmates who were talking about their families' intergenerational immigration stories, right? And so that led me to changing how I do this work forever. I now utilize this fourth harm category that I have defined and taught and shared all over the world, from Italy to California, encouraging people to understand that inflammation of structural harm and structural violence is something that exists in so much of our conflict, even if we're not paying attention to it. Power dynamics between a principal and a teacher, those could just be seen as leadership differential, or we could do a deeper dive and understand what are the compounding power dynamics that are being inflamed right now. What are the historical violent moments that are being inflamed right now? And how do we have a conversation that shifts from you are a racist to you have inflamed these 13 different real experiences all in this one moment? And for me, that is my gift to the movement so far, is creating a framework that fits already into the removed but present facilitator model that allows them to explore what they've inflamed from a place that does not utilize unproductive shame.
Yeah. Can you go over the 4 harm categories really quickly for those that don't know, me included?
Emotional and spiritual harm, material physical harm, communal relational harm, and my 4th one is inflamed structural and inflamed historical harm. So inflamed structural and inflamed historical harm describes harm that either inflames a historical violent moment. So that looks at historical violence that's experienced in one's lifespan or throughout generations. And that definition of historical trauma comes from Maria Yellow, Brave Horse, from Canada. And then the inflamed structural is important for looking at the ways structures, both micro and macro, have caused disproportionate harm in communities. There was a moment at Skidmore College that I wasn't there for but watched as an alum, where student protesters were being made fun of for putting a shift in the cost of laundry as their list of the demands. And this backlash from the community, making fun of them for this request, for me, if I were to look through it through the harm lens, what they were failing to see is that for those students, raising laundry, even by 50 cents, inflames the structural violence of class warfare, of their own experience with economic tokenism, right? So all of these things can absolutely be understood when broken down. It's not just the historical, but it is how we create disproportionate experiences structurally in our current day.
Yeah, no, that was so helpful. I had never heard that. Thank you for that gift. Thank you to all the people who have taught you. I am curious about how you've transitioned out of working in academic spaces, primarily into both the public sphere and other places.
So I was very, very lucky to be able to support the city of Birmingham with its first office of social justice and racial equity, as well as its first office of peace and policy. And in those spaces, what I tried to do was both infuse restorative ethos within our internal government. In small rural areas, sometimes your city government is Birmingham is an urban space, but the South is pretty regionally rural, might be the largest employer of your city. So to have wins that were internal, how we shifted language, how we started to create fertile soil for larger projects to be born. So applying the implementation models that I built for the institutions I've worked with in the past, which I have not named, but I have been a part of over 150 implementations of restorative practices around the globe. I have worked with organizations from London, like the JAGS Foundation, whoop whoop JAGS, the JAGS. I love you guys and I miss you, all the way to the sunny shores of California. And in those spaces built my own implementation track for organizations. But a big part of getting started on that track is making sure your soil is fertile. So what I got to do within the city of Birmingham was just try to infuse the city with the ethos of restorative practices, shifting how we interacted with each other at communal events that were public, put on by the city. At one point, we had almost 100 people sitting in circle to honor the first Black mayor of Birmingham's 40th anniversary of his election. So being able to give the citizens something different on that tier 1 level, that community building level, while working with individuals internally to build that responding to harm work for systems like the Housing Authority was a blessing, and no different really than working within organizations like academic organizations, educational institutions.
Yeah, and I think it kind of speaks to the idea of negative peace that you had mentioned earlier, right? Where people can feel like they are getting by, things are fine, but it's almost like, are we surviving or are we thriving in community, right? And like, how do you help them make that shift? I mean, like, yes, this is exposure to the ideas, but like, what are some of the things that you're willing to share on public airways?
Within government?
Yeah, within government.
So I think that the reality is, I believe that most of this is translatable to whatever community context that the individuals you're working with are in. So in the South, the Black theology, the Black church is something that is crucial and important to the community of that space. Finding ways to translate restorative justice within that cultural experience was quite easy. I remember sitting with the chief judge, and when describing the rhythm of a circle, the one voice at a time, I was like, the passing, I was like, this is communal, just like the passing of the plate. And being able to translate this into something that is culturally relevant and connected to them without removing or watering down or dishonoring the history of the work, but making sure that it's translated so that people can identify in their own cultural and lived experience the restorative ethos that's already there. And then ask them, wouldn't you want more of that?
Mm-hmm.
That feeling, that moment, if it was a huddle on the football field, don't you want more of that? Imagine if we lived in huddle.
Yeah.
And being able to translate that, right? And finding those things for whoever that person is that you're pitching to. What is that thing for you? Look at me. I'm a listener. I'm going to listen to who you are, and then I'm going to give you back what I heard, informed by what I can offer.
Right. Instead of coming in and saying, this is the way that it has to be, this is the thing that's going to solve all of your problems. I have so many conversations, but it's calling me back to someone, maybe it was in multiple conversations, but calling me back to someone just because, like, you're another Black person coming into this community doesn't mean that you know this community and know what's right for this community. And so, like, that listening piece is so important, where, that's what allows you to build community and not be seen as an outsider and be embraced, and, like, have your work be embraced.
I think that as much as I tease that I didn't learn much from my anthropology degree, I think that the mandate to ask questions, that kind of like prime directive, for the for those that are out there that might be relevant, this idea of not inserting myself but asking questions first has definitely impacted and helped my work. It also allows me to move in the spaces that I move. I could go to London and support them address youth knife violence, and that's not my lived experience. The lived experience of African and Caribbean Black youth in England is not translatable to my experience in Alabama and College Park, Georgia. Mm-hmm. It's just not. So asking questions was crucial. Got to Brooklyn and realized I wasn't relevant there either. I needed to understand what brick was so that I could understand if a student says their relationship is brick, that is something that has its own flavor and context. And for those who are like me and did not know what brick meant, brick is cold. And so it's like going into this space and being willing to listen, being willing to see what's going on, I think is really crucial to those of us who try to steward this work in communities that we are not permanently rooted in.
Yeah, for sure. And you, like, as you've now transitioned out of working with city government, you talked about the farm. Tell us about honeycomb consulting and what you're doing there.
So honeycomb consulting, so I'm just so excited. Let me just get my little self together. All right, so Honeycomb Justice Consulting Group is the dream of me and one of my good friends and colleagues who also was trained at Skidmore, Harrison Priest. We really wanted to find a way of merging what we felt was crucial for the organizational fertility for restorative practice. So if we're really thinking about soil, what does soil testing look like? What are the things that we think are important for a community before they implement to already be present, right? It's just getting seeds is not where we need to start this conversation. We need to start this conversation around the soil and identifying what that is for us. And that's active anti-oppressive action within the systems. I need to know that they're doing that work. And if they're not doing that work, I want to be able to support them in jump-starting that. There's a laundry list of things that we look for when it comes to soil fertility for this work, and then merge that with a organizational change informed implementation process for these institutions to infuse restorative justice into their healing skeleton, right? Because they're doing the work to address other ills that exist while we're helping fuse this to the new skeleton. So Honeycomb is a place to do it all, to build from start to finish. I spend a lot of time doing trainings, and when I was doing these kind of one-off trainings and I leave, like sometimes you hear things back, sometimes you don't, sometimes you get, random Christmas cards, but you don't really know if it's stuck, what barriers they ran into, if they needed a hand, if I had the answer for that, and could have helped them address that barrier or partner them with another institution I've worked with that's on a similar path. And so I wanted to not have that be the experience anymore. I wanted to walk organizations through this. And doula, honeycomb, in reality, it's like, how do we doula this change? How do we look at everything that's important before the birth and postpartum, right? It's prenatal and postpartum, and we're here for the labor. Like that holistic work. And also knowing that we don't know everything. And so being in a place where Honeycomb can partner with groups like the Lindsay Group that do industrial psychologists that look at diagnosing organizations truly that are racist and helping them see that in their systems, from their selection processes all the way to their interpersonal HR processes, and merging so that we're really helping an organization turn all the way out. And the reason why is that this is important to me is I've been in too many toxic organizations in my past to know that we leave people behind when we don't push that organization to make all the changes they need to make. They're my customers, and I needed to shift my understanding. They're not doing me a favor by having me come in and helping them do this. My duty is to the larger community. So they have to be willing to make the shifts that are going to be necessary, because I don't want to leave behind someone like me to suffer in an organization that says they do RJ, but for some reason still has blatant abusive racist practices or homophobic practices or transphobic practices within their organization.
Yeah, so the doula metaphor was really powerful, and I think like the other one that comes to mind is like, a gardener, right? Like you talked about like the soil testing, or a farmer, which you're both of. Yeah. And it's like making sure that folks have all they need to not just like sprout or like deliver a baby, but like grow and produce fruit, or like help birth and then raise a child. What are some of the things that you're really excited about, or what are some of the projects that you're really excited about working with Honeycomb, or how can people engage with Honeycomb if they feel like, oh my God, we need this?
So please come find us on like www.honeycombjusticeconsulting.com if you are interested in working with us. Right now, one of my exciting projects is a longer project with Princeton University. I'm just so proud of the work that Princeton has done and has dedicated to when it comes to shifting the experience of how students experience harm on their campus and what community building actually looks like and community healing. I'm so grateful for the individual that brought me in too, because it speaks to the power of anybody who is in an organization. So I'm speaking to you, the power of taking your time and finding who you feel is best fit for your space. And I really appreciate this individual for taking a chance on me and Honeycomb, and allowing us to prove ourselves, to show that we are going to bring that holistic change here. We promise not to bring you window dressing. No more curtains. No more curtains. Like, we promise, no more curtains. We're here to actually do an overhaul. So if that is something that you are interested in, this work does not have to happen like this. A beautiful thing about building relationships is walking a journey with a group. So if you are listening and you're interested in exploring walking a full journey, or even knowing more what that looks like when our team is on the ground, please let us know. And then the other thing that the work our paid work allows us to do is to give our time for free to movement builders that are doing this work and looking to incorporate restorative justice into their movement structure. So we've been able to train, we trained over 10 practitioners over a whole series last fall that identified as queer, trans, people of color. And that being able to make sure that we are onboarding a new talent, a new lens to this movement is crucial to the work that we do at Honeycomb. So the organizations that pair with us, you're also providing a space for people to learn in their own way and contribute to this work and deepen our practices as they help us deepen our understanding of who our collective is.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll definitely link all of those things in the description below, and we'll plug them again at the end. But now I want to transition into the questions that we ask everyone. To start it off, how do you define restorative justice?
I define restorative justice as processes that center the storytelling of our harm for the identifying of our needs, so that we can brainstorm and use radical imagination to meet our needs collectively.
Yeah. What's been a oh shit moment that you've experienced in this work, and what did you learn from it?
I think the first time I was disappointed in a bias case I handled was my oh shit moment. I don't think I know, because it still sits on my soul, and it's almost been a decade. Yeah, that moment, I sat there, I watched that harm party. I know that by the book, we did everything right. And honestly, we got more probably out of that process than any traditional process would have gotten out of that process. But I sat there and I looked at that harm party, and I know that no point, and I go back to the framing, right? How do we frame this so that people can step into this truth, so they can step into this story in a deeper way? That framing did not allow us to explore the deep insidiousness of that harm for that individual. And that sat with me to the point that I kept asking questions until I found an answer for how to fix my process.
Yeah. What is one place or situation you wish people really knew this work?
I want to change the format of journalism.
All right.
I want journalists to use these 4 harm categories. I want them to analyze moments in these 4 harm categories. The watering down of the power of identity politics, right? Identity politics being the focus of the experiences of one identity to understand and advocate for the changes that structurally that need to happen has been watered down to this whininess. And I believe that's because the story of the identity is not fully being experienced through the media. I want to hear a Don Lemon break down a moment, not just what makes him upset about it. I want him to break down what's the emotional impact of this. What is the material impact of this? What is the communal impact of this? And what historical harm and structural harm has been inflamed by this one politician's tweet? Because I think that until we start deepening our storytelling of harm, even if we are not empowered to address that harm, we are validating the experiences of those impacted, and we are expanding the way everyone witnesses a call for accountability.
Yeah.
So yeah, journalist, if you're listening,
I can think of 1 or 2 people who I think listen who are, so shout out to you. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, dead or alive. Who are they, and what do you talk about?
Okay. So, Fannie Lou Hamer, all-time hero. Fannie Lou Hamer, the founder of the Sunflower County Freedom Farm Cooperative, who I named my farm partly after. The other individual that I would add would be Frida. who I also partly named my farm after, Casa Azul, and Prince Nelson Rogers. And I think probably the last person would be Walter Rodney. So Walter Rodney wrote before he was assassinated how Europe underdeveloped Africa. He was a brilliant, brilliant mind and colleague of academic pal of Angela Davis before he was assassinated at a young age. Prince Rogers Nelson was the artist formerly known as Prince. And all of these people, for me, scream radical imagination. And I also, knowing their stories, know that they overcame so much. And as someone who deals with physical disabilities, they all inspire me to use my radical imagination even when I can't use my body.
Yeah.
And that, I just want to know how. I want to know how in Mississippi Fannie Lou tapped into her radical imagination. I want to know about Prince Rogers in Minneapolis. That place is called. Like, where are you tapping into your, radical imagination? Walter Rodney radically reimagined history without all of the, crisis of representation of the 80s in academia. He did it on his own, and I want to know. Oh, can I add one more person?
Sure.
Or I'll kick someone out. Maybe me and Prince will have a private dinner, and I will replace his invitation with Bantu Steve Biko, who has inspired me so much when it comes to community development and is another inspiration for why I wanted this farm to exist in Alabama for Alabamians.
Yeah. And so the conversation is about radical imagination. Is there
It's about radical imagination.
Is there a specific question that comes to mind?
I would like to know when they needed it most. I want to know when they needed their radical imagination the most. Not what inspires them on the regular, but I want to know, in that tough moment or in that moment of solitude. And now that I think about it, the majority of them were incarcerated at some point because of their thoughts. Where did that take you? When did you need it the most? And where did it take you?
Yeah. What's one mantra or affirmation that you want everyone listening to this podcast to know?
So this comes from a Chrisette Michele song from back in the early 2000s, but it has been my mantra for decades. And it is, what's mine will be just for me. What's mine will be just for me. So if it's an opportunity that goes by that you feel like you didn't get, if it's a relationship that has sizzled and died out, if it is an experience even with your own body that is transitioning in ways that you might have called for or called in ways that you might not have called in, just to remind yourself that what is yours will be just for you. When it arrives, it is just for you.
Who's one person that I should have on the podcast? And before you say, you have to help me get them on.
Okay, well, see, that changes my answer, because I feel like I ask this person to do things all the time. But Nuri shifted my understanding of this work when it comes to structural violence back in 2015, and I continue to watch their work. I am continuously in awe of them, and they are just an asset to this world in ways that so many of us don't even know. And Nuri deserves their flowers while Nuri is here.
Absolutely. So I will be looking forward to that introductory email. And to recap, how can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported? We already talked about a couple of them, but just as a last reminder to our folks.
Of course, if you're interested in supporting our business and you're looking for support, please do so. that is not as important to me as furthering the way this work is done. So if someone resonated with that fourth harm category and is interested in learning more about that, we host trainings about just that fourth harm category, asking questions about it, implementing it, adding a structural and historical lens to your work is a way to support me. I need all of us to uplift this collectively as we do this work across this country, especially right now, because I have already run into adults who experienced RJ as children who are already turned off to it. And when asked about that, it is the lack of structural analysis, it is the lack of acknowledgement of historical trauma that turned them away from this work, and I don't want to see that. So if people want to support, please support in amplifying that, and also remembering that by not acknowledging a person of color who has contributed to a movement, a title, a concept, or identified or crafted a concept, you are causing historical harm. So name me, use the work.
Yeah, absolutely. It calls me back to something that you just shared with me. And it has me questioning. This is a conversation that I have with a handful of people. Like, is the term restorative justice outdated? Do we need to be using other language?
Restorative justice is connected to the processes that have been utilized from the 70s to now. And I think that they describe exactly what they are supposed to describe. What needs to evolve is what's being done under that umbrella. Or restorative justice will become an antiquated tool. And it shouldn't be. We don't have to lose the beauty of our interpersonal work because we don't have a structural lens. We just have to add a structural lens. So I don't believe that RJ people need to necessarily jump ship and become TJ people. I also am a TJ practitioner, but that work is very specific. And what I think people need to do is understand where there is learning from the TJ world, acknowledge all of the predominantly queer people of color who have forged that work, and infuse that structural analysis and that learning into the work that we do in restorative justice.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your time. I've learned so much from you, and I can't wait to share this with so many others.
Thank you so much, Jazz, for all you offer this episode. This is Elise here, and here are the things that I've thought about from this episode. One line that really stuck out to me was when Jazz said, "We don't need to start at seeds. Let's start at soil testing." I thought this statement was really important because it brings up the idea that the people who know the community the best are the people within the community. Instead of taking outside seeds, let's start with the soil that already exists to learn what is there and to grow from what we already have. This way we can also see if the soil is ready to have flowers grow, because sometimes a community isn't ready to start planting seeds and they need to instead change the soil. In what ways do you check in with your community in order to change the soil? Another idea that Jazz brought up was radical imagination. How do you use radical imagination to help further your community? Thank you so much for listening today, and don't forget to check out our YouTube channel and our Future Ancestors Collective. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.